I was 13 years old when my parents handed me to a predator and thanked him for taking me. They needed a vacation, 2 weeks on a cruise to save their marriage, and I was the inconvenience they needed to store somewhere. So they left me with Uncle Robert, the man who lived alone in that old house at the end of the road, the man everyone called eccentric and lonely, the man my mother defended every time someone whispered concerns. I still remember standing in his doorway with my suitcase watching my parents' car disappear down the street. My mother didn't look back. Not once. For 9 days, I lived in a cage I couldn't name. No phone calls, no letters, no open doors, just Robert's smile, too warm, too knowing, and the feeling that something was very, very wrong. On the 9th night, I found the basement. And what I discovered inside didn't just reveal what Robert was. It revealed what my mother had been hiding for 20 years. When my parents finally opened that front door, my mother fell to her knees and whispered, "Please, no, anything but this." She wasn't begging for my safety, she was begging for my silence. Have you ever discovered a truth that destroyed everything you believed about the people who were supposed to protect you? My name is Jessica Bishop. I'm 36 years old, and I run a nonprofit organization called Voice First that helps children speak up when their families won't listen. Last month, a woman in her 50s contacted me, a survivor of the same man who nearly destroyed me. She had been silent for 35 years. That conversation is why I'm finally sharing my story publicly, because silence protects no one. Growing up, I was loved in the way you love something convenient. My parents provided for me. They showed up to my school events, they said the right things at the right times, but I always felt like an afterthought, something to be managed rather than cherished. My mother, Linda, was often distant, anxious, her mind somewhere else, even when she was sitting right next to me. My father, David, measured his love in paychecks and assumed everything was fine, as long as no one was crying. The summer I turned 13, their marriage was falling apart. They fought in whispers after I went to bed, thinking I couldn't hear. My mother suggested a cruise, 2 weeks to reconnect. I wasn't included in these plans. I was the problem they needed to solve before they could focus on themselves. That's when Uncle Robert stepped in. At a family barbecue 2 months earlier, Robert had been unusually attentive to me. He asked about school, my hobbies, my friends' questions that felt strange coming from a man who had barely spoken to me before. I thought it was weird, but harmless. I didn't understand that predators don't act randomly. They watch, they wait, they plan. Somehow Robert knew about my parents' marriage troubles. Later, I would wonder how. Had my mother confided in him? Had he been paying closer attention than anyone realized? He made his offer casually at another family dinner. "You two need time alone. Send Jessica to me for a couple weeks. I have that big house all to myself. Family helps family." My father thought it was generous. My mother hesitated just 1 second, one flicker of something I couldn't name. "I don't know," she started to say, but my father cut her off. "It's perfect. This is what family does." The trap was set, and my parents walked right into it, dragging me along. A week before the trip, I overheard my mother on the phone, her voice tense and defensive. "I know what everyone thinks about him, but he's family. We can't abandon him just because he's different. Maybe having Jessica there will be good for him." I assumed she was defending the weird uncle everyone whispered about at gatherings. I didn't know she was defending the man who had once destroyed her, and that her defense was really self-defense. Admitting Robert was dangerous meant admitting something she had buried for 20 years. 2 days before I was supposed to leave, Aunt Grace called. I heard my mother's voice turn sharp. "Grace, stop. You've been suspicious of him for 20 years based on nothing." Then lower. "She's my daughter. Stop acting like you know what's best for everyone." After the call, my mother looked shaken. When I asked what was wrong, she just said, "Your aunt worries too much. There's nothing wrong with Robert. He's just lonely." I didn't know that Grace had watched her sister change after the summer of 1984, that she had asked my mother 100 times what happened in that house, that my mother had denied everything until Grace started doubting her own instincts. Grace couldn't prove anything, but her gut had been screaming for 2 decades. And now history was about to repeat itself. Looking back, I understand something painful. My parents weren't leaving me with my uncle for 2 weeks. They were handing me to a man who had been waiting for this moment, planning for it for years. My father didn't know, but my mother, somewhere deep down in a place she refused to look. I think she did. And she left me anyway. The day my parents drove away, I stood in the doorway of Robert's house, and watched until their car disappeared around the corner. My mother never looked back. Not once. Robert placed his hand on my shoulder, and something in me wanted to flinch away, but I was 13 and I had been taught to be polite, so I smiled and followed him inside. That first evening, Robert made dinner, chicken parmesan with extra cheese exactly the way I liked it. He set the plate in front of me with a proud smile like he had accomplished something remarkable. I stared at it confused. I had never told him this was my favorite meal. I had never eaten it in front of him. How did he know? During dinner, he asked about my best friend Megan by name. He mentioned the book series I was reading. He knew I was struggling with algebra and offered to help. Every detail was correct. Every fact was precise. It was like he had been studying me. How do you know all that? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Robert's smile didn't waver. I pay attention to family, Jessica. Especially you. You've always been special to me. It should have been flattering, a lonely uncle taking interest in his niece. But something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I was 13 years old. I didn't have the vocabulary to describe what I was feeling, but my body understood before my mind did. Something was wrong with this man. Something was very, very wrong. Years later, I would understand what Robert had been doing. He had been collecting information about me at every family gathering, listening to my conversations, asking my parents casual questions, building a profile of who I was, what I liked, what made me feel comfortable. He had been preparing for this moment for years. I wasn't a guest in his house. I was prey that had finally walked into a trap he had spent a long time building. The rules started on day 2, and they came so gradually that I almost didn't notice them forming into a cage around me. The phone line has been giving me trouble, Robert said, when I asked to call Megan. It cuts in and out, very frustrating. The phone stayed broken for 2 weeks. I never saw him call a repairman. It's too hot to go outside during the day, he said when I asked to take a walk. It was 72 degrees. There was a nice breeze, but I stayed inside because he said so. Family doesn't close doors on each other, he told me on day 3. After that, even the bathroom door had to stay cracked open. I learned to change clothes in the corner where the angle made it impossible to see through the gap. I told myself this was normal. Some families were just more open than others. I'll mail your letters to your friends, he offered when I wrote to Megan. I gave him 3 letters that first week. He never left the house to go to the post office. When I asked about it, he said he was waiting until he had more errands to run. The letters sat on the hallway table unmoved day after day. You don't need to bother the neighbors, he said when I mentioned the woman I had seen gardening next door. They're not friendly people. They keep to themselves. Best not to disturb them. By day 4, I realized I hadn't spoken to a single person outside those walls. No phone calls, no letters sent, no walks outside, no contact with neighbors. I was disappearing from the world, and no one knew it. No one was checking on me. No one was paying attention. There was one door in that house that was always locked. It was at the end of the hallway on the first floor, and it led down to the basement. I noticed it on day 2 because every other door in the house stayed open. Robert's rule about family not closing doors apparently didn't apply to that one. What's down there? I asked him, trying to sound casual. Something flickered across his face. Just for a moment. Just long enough for me to notice. Then his smile returned smooth and warm. Old storage. Family things from my father. Nothing interesting, I promise. You don't need to worry about it. But late at night when Robert thought I was asleep, I heard things. The creak of that basement door opening. Footsteps going down the stairs. He would stay down there for an hour sometimes, occasionally longer. And when he came back up, he was different, calmer, almost peaceful. Like whatever was in that room renewed him somehow. I started to dread the sound of that door. I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to his footsteps descend into whatever secret he kept below. That room held something. I could feel it in my bones. I just didn't know what yet. And part of me was afraid to find out. The worst part of those 2 weeks wasn't the isolation, it wasn't the rules, it wasn't even the locked basement door. The worst part was how Robert made me doubt my own mind. He never yelled at me, he never threatened me, he never touched me inappropriately. Instead, he did something far more damaging. He made me feel crazy for being uncomfortable. You seem tense, Jessica, he would say, tilting his head with concern. Is something wrong? Don't you trust your family? I'm just trying to take care of you. He would remind me gently, "Your parents asked me to keep you safe. That's all I'm doing." "You're very imaginative," he told me once when I said the house felt strange. That's a gift. But sometimes imagination can make us see problems where there aren't any. Every time I felt afraid, he had an explanation that made me feel foolish. Every time my instincts screamed that something was wrong, he smiled and made me question whether I was being dramatic. He was patient. He was kind. He was reasonable. And slowly I started to believe that the problem wasn't him. The problem was me. On day 7, I was allowed to call my mother. Robert stood 3 feet away the entire time, smiling, listening to every word. I gripped the phone and tried to find the courage to tell her the truth. "Mom, I want to come home." "Don't be difficult, Jessica." Her voice was sharp and patient. "Uncle Robert is doing us a favor. We need this time. You know that." "But I don't feel, Jessica." The word cut through me like a knife. Final, dismissive. "Everything is fine. Just be good. We'll be back soon." I hung up the phone. Robert's smile widened. "See," he said softly. "Everything's fine, just like I said." That night I lay in bed and wondered if I was the problem. Maybe I was ungrateful. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was imagining monsters where there were none. Maybe Robert was just a lonely man trying to connect with his family, and I was too immature to appreciate it. This is what predators count on. They don't trap your body first. They trap your mind. They make you your own jailer, questioning your own perceptions until you can't trust anything you feel. By the end of that first week, I wasn't afraid of Robert anymore. I was afraid that I was crazy, that nothing was actually wrong, that I was an ungrateful child who deserved to be left in this house with a man who smiled too much and knew too much and kept a basement door locked for reasons he wouldn't explain. That's the thing about predators. They don't just build cages out of walls and rules. They build cages out of doubt. And I was starting to lock myself inside when convinced that the bars weren't even real. But doubt can only hold you prisoner for so long. Eventually, something breaks through. For me, it happened on the 9th night, and it changed everything I thought I knew about my family, my mother, and the man who had been watching me my entire life. Robert drank heavily that evening, more than usual. I had noticed him drinking wine with dinner every night, but this was different. He opened a bottle of whiskey after I said goodnight and kept pouring. By 10 o'clock, he was passed out on the couch, the empty bottle on the floor beside him, his breathing heavy and slow. I couldn't sleep. I hadn't really slept in days. My body existed in a constant state of alertness, waiting for something I couldn't name. Every creak of the house made me tense. Every shadow felt like a threat. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing in circles, still trying to convince myself that nothing was wrong, while every instinct screamed otherwise. Around midnight, I got up to get water. The house was dark except for a small lamp Robert had left on in the living room. As I passed through, I saw him sprawled on the couch, completely unconscious. And on the floor, half hidden under the coffee table, I saw his keys. They must have fallen from his pocket when he collapsed. I almost walked past them, almost went to the kitchen, got my water, and went back to bed. But something made me stop. Something made me kneel down and pick them up. Among the familiar keys was one I didn't recognize. It was smaller than the others, older. The brass was worn smooth from years of use. I knew immediately what door it opened. I wasn't planning to investigate. I wasn't that brave. I was a 13-year-old girl who had spent the past week being told she was imagining things. But something pulled me toward that basement door. Maybe it was the desperate need to prove I wasn't crazy. Maybe it was the need to find evidence that something was actually wrong, that my instincts weren't betraying me. Or maybe it was just survival instinct, the same instinct that tells a trapped animal to understand its cage. I walked to the end of the hallway. I put the key in the lock. I turned it. And I went down into the darkness. What I found in that basement still visits me in nightmares 23 years later. The room was organized with horrifying precision, like a museum dedicated to something unspeakable. Photographs covered one entire wall, arranged in neat rows by year. The oldest photos were faded, some from the 1970s and early 1980s. The newest were only a few years old. Different girls, different decades, but all around the same age, 11 or 12 or 13. All with the same uncertain smile, the same innocent eyes that had no idea what was coming. Shelves lined another wall filled with labeled boxes. I opened one with trembling hands and found personal items. Hair clips, friendship bracelets, a small stuffed rabbit with matted fur, a bracelet with the name Katie engraved on it, a locket, a ribbon from a school award ceremony, trophies. He had kept trophies from each of them. A journal sat on a small desk in the corner. I opened it and began to read. The entries spanned 30 years. Descriptions of what he called his special girls, notes about their habits, their families, their vulnerabilities, how he identified them, how he gained their trust, how he isolated them, I stopped reading. I couldn't continue. I didn't need to see more to understand what I was looking at. I wasn't Robert's first victim. I was simply the latest addition to a collection that had been growing for 3 decades. All those girls on the wall, all those items in the boxes, all those pages in the journal. He had been doing this for longer than I had been alive. Then I found the smaller album. It was newer than the others, the cover still shiny, the pages crisp. I opened it and my blood turned to ice in my veins. It was filled with photographs of me. Birthday parties I recognized instantly. My 7th birthday at the pizza place with the arcade games. My 10th birthday in our backyard. My 12th birthday at the bowling alley with Megan and my other friends. School events. The science fair where I won 3rd place for my volcano project. The spring concert where I played the flute badly. My soccer games taken from the sidelines at angles that suggested he wasn't supposed to be there. And others. Photos I had never seen before. Taken from a distance. At my school, through the fence during recess. At the park near my house where I rode my bike. At the mall with my friends shot from across the food court. Robert had been following me, watching me, photographing me, for years. I understood then that I wasn't an accidental victim. I wasn't just a convenient niece whose parents needed a babysitter. I was his target. Everything, the offer to watch me, the timing of my parents' cruise. The broken phone, the rules that kept me isolated, all of it had been planned, orchestrated, perfected over decades of practice. I had never been a guest in this house. I was prey that had finally walked into a trap he had spent years building just for me. But the worst discovery was still waiting, the one that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my own mother. In the oldest section of the photograph wall, I found a faded picture that made my legs give out beneath me. I sank to the cold basement floor, unable to breathe, unable to think. The photo showed a girl, maybe 12 or 13 years old. She was standing in front of this very house wearing a floral dress, her smile uncertain and shy. Her face was so familiar, it took me a moment to understand why. She looked almost exactly like me. With shaking hands, I turned the photograph over. On the back in Robert's neat handwriting were words that destroyed my world. Summer 1984. My first special girl, the one who got away. It was my mother. My mother had stood in this exact spot, had been one of Robert's special girls, had lived through whatever horrors happened in this house when she was my age. She knew, she had always known what he was. And she had sent me here anyway. Not because she thought I would be safe, but because admitting Robert was dangerous meant admitting that what happened to her was real. It meant facing 20 years of buried trauma. It meant accepting that she had never really gotten away at all. My mother hadn't protected me because protecting me meant destroying the lie she had been telling herself for 2 decades. I don't remember climbing the stairs. I don't remember locking myself in my room. My body moved on autopilot while my mind remained frozen in that basement. I clutched my mother's photograph like it was evidence in a trial, which I suppose it was. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed shaking, watching the door jumping at every sound. I pushed a chair under the doorknob. I held my breath every time I heard Robert move. The next morning, he announced he needed groceries. The moment his car disappeared down the road, I ran. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor 3 houses away, found me on her doorstep. I was breathless, shaking, unable to form complete sentences. She asked if my uncle knew I was there. I begged her to let me use her phone. I told her it was a family emergency. She looked at me for a long moment, and maybe she saw something in my eyes that told her not to ask questions. She let me inside. I called Aunt Grace. The conversation came out in fragments, barely coherent. I told her she had to come. I told her I found something about Robert, about Mom, about everything. I begged her to come get me. Grace didn't hesitate. She said she was coming. She told me not to go back to that house. But I knew if I wasn't there when Robert returned, he would realize something was wrong. He might destroy the evidence. He might disappear. He might escape justice like he had for 30 years. So I went back. Not because I was brave. because I was more afraid of him getting away with it than I was of staying. The next 5 days were the longest of my life. I smiled when he smiled. I ate dinner across from him. I said good morning and good night while my heart pounded so hard I was certain he could hear it. I wasn't being strategic. I was just surviving, counting hours, praying that grace would arrive before something in me finally broke. I didn't know exactly what would happen when my parents came back. I had no plan. Just one photograph, one phone call, and 5 days of pretending to be okay while sleeping with a chair against my door. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. When they returned, when they looked at me expecting their quiet, obedient daughter, they would find someone else. Someone who knew the truth. Someone who refused to disappear. The truth was coming. And this time, no one was going to bury it. Grace arrived on day 12, 2 days before my parents were scheduled to return from their cruise. I was standing at the window watching Robert read the newspaper in the living room, counting the minutes until I could retreat to my room again, when I saw a car pull into the driveway. A car I recognized. I was out the front door before I could think. Grace barely had time to close her car door before I threw myself into her arms. She held me tight, so tight I could barely breathe, and whispered into my hair, I'm here, you're safe now." She had driven through the night stopping only for gas. 6 hours of dark highway because a 13-year-old girl had called her with fragments of a story that didn't make sense, but somehow made perfect sense. She hadn't asked questions. She hadn't doubted. She had just come. Robert appeared in the doorway behind us, his face a mask of confusion and suspicion. "Grace, what are you doing here? No one told me you were coming." Grace looked at him over my head. I felt her body tense, felt 20 years of suppressed suspicion finally hardening into certainty. "I'm here for my niece." "She's fine." Robert's voice was smooth, reasonable, the same voice he had used on me for 12 days. "We've had a lovely time together." "I'm sure you have." The silence that followed was heavy with things unsaid. Grace wanted to take me right then. I could feel it in the way she held me, the way she positioned her body between me and the house, but I stopped her. "If we leave now," I whispered so only she could hear, "they'll say I ran away. Mom will cover for him." "You know she will. I need her to see. I need her to look at this photo and tell me to my face that nothing happened." Grace pulled back and looked at me. Really looked at me. And in that moment, I think she saw that I wasn't just a scared little girl anymore. I was someone who had discovered an ugly truth and refused to let it stay buried. She understood. She checked into a motel 10 minutes away and gave me something I had never had before, a prepaid cell phone. "If anything happens," she said, gripping my shoulders, "anything at all, you call me. I'll be there in minutes. Do you understand?" I nodded. For the first time in 12 days, I wasn't alone. I had backup. I had a witness ready and waiting. Those last 2 days passed in a blur of forced normalcy. I smiled at Robert. I ate his food. I answered his questions. But everything was different now. Grace was nearby. The phone was hidden in my pillowcase. And the photograph of my mother was tucked inside my shirt, pressed against my skin like armor. On day 13, Grace made a phone call that changed everything. She didn't wait for the cruise to end naturally. She called my parents directly. "Your daughter is in danger," she told them. "Come home now. If you don't, I'm calling the police myself." I found out later that my father was confused and angry. What danger Jessica is with family. Grace is being dramatic, but my mother was silent. Too silent. She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She just agreed to come home. They cut their cruise short by 1 day. That's how everyone ended up at Robert's door at the same time on day 14. Not coincidence. Not luck. Grace had forced a confrontation that was 20 years overdue. I heard the car pull up. I heard the doors slam. I heard my father's voice, irritated and exhausted, demanding to know what was going on. And I heard my mother's silence, heavy and terrible, as she walked toward the house, where her nightmare had begun 3 decades ago. They came through the front door together, my parents and Grace right behind them. Robert played his part perfectly. The gracious host, bewildered by all this unnecessary drama. He spread his hands and smiled that warm, reasonable smile. "I don't understand what this is about. Jessica and I have had a wonderful 2 weeks." Then they saw me. I was standing in the middle of the living room, silent, still, holding an old photograph in my hands. My father spoke first. What the hell is going on here, Grace? You scared us half to death with that phone call. What danger? Jessica looks fine. But my mother didn't speak. Her eyes had found the photograph, and she couldn't look away. I watched her face go pale, watched recognition flicker in her eyes, watched her throat move as she swallowed. Where did you get that? Her voice was wrong, too controlled, too quiet. The voice of someone trying very hard not to scream. You know where. Give it to me, Jessica. No, give it to me right now. Her voice was shaking now. She stepped forward, reaching for the photo with trembling hands. I stepped back. Not until you tell them. Tell Dad, tell everyone. What happened in this house? What he did to you. The room went completely silent. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. I could hear Robert's breathing change. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. My father looked from me to my mother, confusion slowly giving way to something darker. Linda, what is she talking about? My mother's face cycled through emotions I will never forget. Shock, denial, fear, and beneath it all, a desperate animal need to keep the lie alive just a little longer. She's confused, my mother said. Her voice cracked on the word. She found some old photos in the basement. She's imagining things. You know how teenagers are. Robert nodded eagerly beside her. The girl has an overactive imagination. I've noticed it all week. I didn't do anything wrong. She's been acting strange since she got here. For one terrible moment I saw my future. Being labeled hysterical, being dismissed as a dramatic teenager, being forced to swallow the lie and join the long line of silenced girls whose photographs hung on that basement wall. My mother's eyes met mine, and in them I saw a plea. Please, just pretend, like I did, like I've been doing for 20 years. Please don't make me face this. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw not a protector, but a frightened woman who had never stopped being that 13-year-old girl in the photograph. I understood why she had chosen silence 20 years ago. She had been a child with no power and no one who would believe her, but today she was choosing silence again. As an adult, as a mother, with her own daughter standing in front of her, holding proof of a crime that had nearly been repeated. And that choice was unforgivable. No. One word, quiet, firm, without tears. I found the basement, Mom. I saw the photos, all of them, decades of them. I saw your photo, I read his journal, I know what he is, I know what he did to you and all those other girls, and I know you knew, and you sent me here anyway. My mother's legs buckled beneath her. She didn't fall dramatically like in the movies. She just crumpled like a puppet whose strings had been cut. She sank to the floor in the middle of Robert's living room, and a sound came out of her that I had never heard before, something between a moan and a whisper. Please, she said, please don't do this. She wasn't talking to me, not really. She was talking to the past, begging it to stay buried for just a little longer. No, I said again. I'm not you. I won't be silent. Not for you, not for him, not for anyone. Grace stepped forward, her phone already in her hand. It's over, Linda. I'm calling the police. And she did. The officers arrived within 30 minutes. They searched the basement. They photographed every picture on that wall, every item in those boxes, every page of that journal. Decades of evidence that had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to find it. Robert tried to run when he realized what was happening. He made it as far as the backyard before 2 officers tackled him to the ground. I watched from the window as they handcuffed him face down in the grass. No dramatic confrontation, no villain's monologue, just a 60-year-old man crying in the dirt saying it's not what it looks like, over and over while nobody listened. In the weeks that followed, the story spread. 5 other women came forward, women who had been Robert's special girls in the 1980s and 1990s. Women who had stayed silent for decades because no one believed them or because they had convinced themselves it wasn't real. My photograph on the news gave them permission to finally speak. Robert was charged with 31 counts of possession of child exploitation material, 4 counts of child endangerment, and 2 counts of sexual abuse of a minor based on testimony from survivors who finally had the courage to come forward. The district attorney considered charging my mother with child endangerment. In the end, they decided it was unprovable. How do you prove someone knew something they had spent 20 years convincing themselves never happened? My mother escaped legal consequences. But watching the detective explain why they couldn't charge her, watching the strange mix of relief and devastation on her face, I understood something important. My mother hadn't gotten away with anything. She would be her own prison for the rest of her life. My mother wasn't a monster. I understand that now. She was a victim who never healed, who buried her trauma so deep she convinced herself it wasn't real. But here's the thing about burying things. They don't stay buried. They grow roots, they spread, they reach up and grab the next generation. My mother's silence didn't protect her. It created me another potential victim. And the only way to stop the cycle was to become the one who finally spoke. I was 13 years old, and I refused to be buried. The justice system moved slowly, but it moved. Robert Bishop stood trial 8 months after his arrest. The evidence from that basement was overwhelming. The photographs, the journal, the personal items from girls spanning 3 decades. And the testimony of 6 women, including myself, who finally had the chance to tell the world what he had done. The judge called him a predator who had weaponized family trust for 30 years. He was convicted on 31 counts of possession of child exploitation material, 4 counts of child endangerment, and 2 counts of sexual abuse of a minor. The sentence was 40 years in federal prison. Robert was 58 years old. He would never see freedom again. He died in the prison infirmary 7 years later. Alone. No one visited him in those final days. No one claimed his remains. There was no obituary, no funeral, no marker to show he had ever existed. His name sits on the National Sex Offender Registry, a permanent record of what he was. The family can no longer pretend ignorance. The community knows exactly who Robert Bishop was and what he did. He didn't die dramatically. He just ended, quietly, forgotten, erased from a world that had finally seen him clearly. That's the thing about predators who hide behind family. When the mask falls off, they have nothing left. No real relationships, no genuine love, just a lifetime of manipulation that everyone finally sees for what it was. Robert spent his final years surrounded by concrete walls and the weight of his crimes with nothing but time to remember all the lives he destroyed. I hope he thought about us. I hope he thought about us every single day. My father's reaction to the truth was not what I expected. David Bishop wasn't a villain. That's what made his role in all of this so complicated. He genuinely didn't know about my mother's past. She had never told him. To him, Robert was just the odd brother-in-law who lived alone and seemed harmless. My father had handed me over with a $20 bill and a clear conscience, believing he was doing something good for the family, when the full truth came out when he learned what Robert was. And what my mother had known, he didn't rage at Robert. He didn't rush to comfort me. Instead, he turned to my mother and said 5 words that ended their marriage. You knew, this whole time. They divorced 6 months later, but here's the thing that still hurts even now. My father never really reached out to me either. Not in any meaningful way. He called a few times in that first year. He sent birthday cards with generic messages, but he never asked how I was coping. He never offered to go to therapy with me. He never said he was sorry for not seeing what was right in front of him. I think looking at me reminded him of his own failure, the fact that he had handed his daughter to a predator and thanked him for the favor. Rather than face that guilt, rather than do the hard work of rebuilding our relationship, he chose his own kind of denial. He pretended I didn't exist. Last I heard, he remarried a few years ago. He has stepchildren now. I hope he protects them better than he protected me. I hope he pays attention. I hope he asks questions when something feels wrong. I haven't spoken to my father in 12 years. I don't miss him. I'm just done expecting him to be someone he isn't. Some people can't face their failures. My father is one of them. I've made peace with that. My mother lived another 19 years after that day in Robert's living room. 19 years of therapy and medication and the slow, painful work of facing what she had buried for so long. I'm told she worked hard at recovery. I'm told she finally acknowledged what Robert did to her in 1984 and stopped pretending it wasn't real. She wrote me letters, every month, sometimes every week. Long letters full of explanations and apologies and memories she was finally allowing herself to acknowledge. She wrote about her childhood, about that summer, about the shame that had kept her silent for 2 decades. She wrote about watching me grow up and wanting to protect me, but not knowing how because she had never protected herself. I read every letter, every single one, and I never replied. Not once. When I got married at 29, my mother wasn't invited. When I had my daughter at 33, my mother never held her grandchild. She knew about these milestones. I'm sure Grace told her, but she was not welcome in the life I was building. This was her punishment worse than any prison sentence. Being cut off from the future, watching from a distance as her daughter built the life she should have helped create, knowing that her silence had cost her everything. My mother died of pancreatic cancer when I was 35. Aunt Grace called me with the news. I went to the funeral, not to forgive and not to mourn. I went to close a door that had been open for too long. I stood beside her casket and looked at her face one final time. I waited to feel something, rage maybe, or grief, or even relief, but there was nothing. Just emptiness where a mother-daughter relationship should have been. A hollow space in the shape of all the years we should have had together if she had just been brave enough to speak. I didn't leave flowers. I didn't say goodbye. I turned and walked away. I didn't forgive her. I don't know if I ever will. But I released her. I released the hope that she would somehow become the mother I needed. And in doing that, I finally released myself. Today, I am 36 years old. I run a nonprofit organization called Voice First that helps children speak up when their families won't listen. Over the past 7 years, we have helped more than 200 children escape situations that their relatives refuse to see. We train teachers and counselors to recognize the signs. We provide legal resources for families seeking protection orders. We give children the words and the support to say what no one wants to hear. Last month, a woman in her 50s contacted our organization. She had been one of Robert's victims in 1987. For 35 years, she had convinced herself it wasn't real, that she had imagined the whole thing. Then she saw an article about my work about Voice First, and something broke open inside her. I thought I was the only one, she told me through tears when we finally met. I thought I was crazy. That conversation is why I'm sharing my story publicly now, because there are more survivors out there, more children who were never believed, more adults still carrying the weight of family secrets that should have been exposed decades ago. I am married now to a man named Daniel who knows my whole story, every ugly piece of it. He loves me not despite what happened, but with full understanding of who I became because of it. We have a daughter. She is 6 years old and her name is Grace. I named her after the aunt who drove through the night without hesitation, the woman who believed me without proof, who showed me that family isn't just blood. It's the people who show up when it matters. Aunt Grace is 71 now. She comes to every birthday party, every holiday dinner, every school play. She is the grandmother my daughter knows and loves. The one who reads bedtime stories in funny voices. The one who sneaks extra cookies when she thinks I'm not looking. The one who makes sure my daughter always feels seen and heard and believed. Some bonds aren't blood, they're choice. And I have spent my adult life choosing people who choose me back. My mother's silence lasted 20 years. In that time, Robert hurt other children. Other families were destroyed. Other girls became ghosts in that basement collection, their photographs pinned to a wall where no one would find them. But my voice, the voice of a 13-year-old girl who found a photograph and refused to pretend she hadn't, that voice ended it. That voice brought 30 years of crimes into the light. That voice gave 5 other women permission to finally speak their truth. People ask me if I got my revenge. I tell them revenge was never the point. The point was breaking the cycle. The point was making sure no other little girl would stand in that basement finding photographs of the victims who came before her, knowing her face would be added to the collection next. Some people think justice is about punishment. For me, justice was simpler. I survived. I spoke. I built a life. And I made sure Robert Bishop's legacy wasn't silence. It was noise. Noise that will echo long after I'm gone. If you're listening to this and you were that child who wasn't believed, I want you to know something. I believe you. Your story matters. Your voice matters. And it's never too late to use it, because the only thing more powerful than a family's silence is one person brave enough to break it. Jessica's story is not just a story. It is a mirror held up to families everywhere, reflecting truths that many would rather not see. As we come to the end of this journey with her, I want to take a moment to talk about what we can learn from what happened to Jessica. To her mother, Linda, and to all the girls whose photographs hung on that basement wall for decades. The first and most important lesson is this: believe children when they tell you something is wrong. Children do not have the vocabulary to describe abuse. They do not have the life experience to identify manipulation. But they have instincts. They have feelings. And when a child says they are uncomfortable, when they say they don't want to be around someone, when they say something feels wrong, we owe it to them to listen. Not dismiss, not rationalize, not explain away. Listen. Jessica tried to tell her mother she was uncomfortable with Robert. Her feelings were dismissed as rudeness. She tried to call home during those 2 weeks. Her concerns were brushed aside as being difficult. Every adult in her life chose convenience over curiosity. They chose to believe the comfortable lie rather than investigate the uncomfortable truth. And Jessica nearly paid the price for their willful blindness. If you are a parent, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, a teacher, a neighbor, anyone who has children in your life, please remember this. Your job is not to keep the peace. Your job is to keep children safe. And sometimes those two things are in direct conflict. The second lesson is about silence. Silence does not protect victims. Silence protects predators. Linda stayed silent for 20 years because she convinced herself that speaking would make things worse. She told herself that keeping the secret would protect her family, protect her marriage, protect her sanity. But silence does not protect. It festers, it grows, it reaches forward through time and grabs the next generation. Linda's silence did not protect her. It created another victim. It would have created more if Jessica had not found the courage to speak. If you are carrying a secret, if something happened to you that you have never told anyone, please know that your silence is not keeping anyone safe. It is only keeping the person who hurt you comfortable. Speaking is terrifying. I know that. But silence is not safety. Silence is a prison that you build around yourself while your abuser walks free. The third lesson is about family. We are taught from childhood that family is sacred. Blood is thicker than water. You stand by family no matter what. These lessons are drilled into us so deeply that many people will tolerate the intolerable rather than break ranks. But family should never be an excuse to ignore abuse. Family should never be a shield that protects predators. The word family should not carry more weight than the word safety. Robert hid behind family for 30 years. He used family gatherings to identify victims. He used family loyalty to silence suspicion. He used the word family like a weapon, and everyone let him because they had been taught that family means not asking hard questions. Real family is not about blood. Real family is about who shows up when it matters. Aunt Grace was real family. She drove through the night without hesitation because she believed Jessica. She didn't have proof. She just had love and instinct and the willingness to act. That is family. The fourth lesson is about recognizing the signs. Predators do not look like monsters. They look like uncles and coaches and family friends. They are charming. They are helpful. They are the person who volunteers to babysit when you need a break. They gain access through trust, and they maintain that access by being useful. Watch for adults who seem too interested in specific children. Watch for adults who want to be alone with children. Watch for adults who give gifts without reason or who know too much about a child's life. Watch for isolation tactics, for rules that cut children off from communication with others. These are red flags. Do not ignore them because the person seems nice. Nice is a costume that predators wear very well. The fifth and final lesson is about healing. Jessica did not let her trauma define her. She survived. She spoke. She built a life. She turned her pain into purpose by creating an organization that helps other children speak up. Healing does not mean forgetting. It does not mean forgiving. It means not letting what happened to you become the only thing you are. It means taking the broken pieces and building something new. If you are a survivor, if you are carrying wounds that have never healed, please know that it is not too late. It is not too late to speak. It is not too late to seek help. It is not too late to build the life you deserve. Your past does not have to be your future. You are more than what happened to you. Now, I want to speak directly to you, the person listening to the story. If Jessica's story moved you, if it made you think about your own family, your own experiences, your own children or grandchildren, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me what you think. Did this story resonate with you? Do you know someone who needs to hear this message? Have you ever seen the signs that something was wrong and not known what to do? Your comments help this story reach more people. Every comment, every like, every share pushes this video further into the world where someone who needs to hear it might find it. And if you have not already, please subscribe to this channel We tell stories like this one because they matter. Because somewhere out there, a child is being told they are imagining things. Somewhere out there, an adult is carrying a secret that is destroying them. Somewhere out there, a family is choosing peace over protection. These stories are not just entertainment. They are education. They are validation. They are proof that survival is possible, and speaking up can change everything. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. You never know whose life you might change. Thank you for listening to Jessica's story. Thank you for staying until the end. And remember, the only thing more powerful than a family's silence is one person brave enough to break it. Be that person. Believe children. Speak up. And never let anyone convince you that keeping the peace is more important than keeping people safe. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.